Nirmal Kanti Majumdar Memorial Lecture Series on issues in economic theory and policy. I extend my welcome to Professor Amitava Krishna Dutt, Professor Majumdar, Professor Kumar Sinha. This is the first time when Professor Mukul Majumdar, who is actually the funder of this program, is with us. So first I'll request Mukulda to say something.
Thank you. These are difficult times, so I'm very touched that the faculty members of presidency have organized this event, and I'm really very grateful for their efforts. As I said a few minutes ago when I was chatting, the link goes back to 1898 with presidency in my family on my mother's side, when the grandfather graduated. Then my father and an uncle, and then a boatload of cousins and so on. The link, of course, the direct link is broken. My son chose Cornell and Columbia, and it's unlikely that my grandson will go to presidency. But in our family, presidency has a unique place. So I'm really getting emotional, but I'm really touched that despite all the difficulties all around us, we have been able to gather and to listen to a distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Now we will start with a brief introduction by Dr. Gagari Chakraborty, followed by Dr. Pitch.
Thank you, Moushumi. So, Department of Economics, Presidency University is organizing the one-day conference on issues in economic theory and policy every second year since 2015. This conference is funded by a generous endowment given by Professor Mukul Majumdar, H.T. Warshaw and Robert Irving Warshaw Professor in the Economics Department at Cornell University, in the memory of his late father, Professor Nirmal Kanti Majumdar, an ex-faculty in the Political Science Department, Presidency College. Professor Nirmal Kanti Majumdar was a teacher of political science in the erstwhile Presidency College. He had the rare distinction of being a scholar as well as teacher of high repute, and his students still fondly recall with admiration his encyclopedic grip over topics as varied as Aristotle's Politics, the French Fifth Republic, or the newly drafted, of course in the early 1960s, the Ceylonese Constitution. His Bangla translation of Politics is recorded as Seminar. On retirement from the West Bengal Educational Service, Professor Majumdar went on to teach at the Postgraduate Department of Political Science at the University of Calcutta for several more years, during which time he also served with distinction in West Bengal State Textbook Board as a senior expert. He also regularly published works of fiction in many famous contemporary Bangla literary magazines such as Probashi, Bharatbarsha, etc. Even though his direct involvement with the Presidency College was not very long, but his real involvement was much deeper and longer. All three of his sons were students of Presidency College, and the youngest, Professor Mukul Majumdar of Cornell University, USA, has strengthened that bond by instituting the Nirmal Kanti Majumdar Endowment Fund in Presidency University. In this new university, we hope to keep the spirit of Professor Nirmal Kanti Majumdar's scholarship and pedagogy alive, and this endowment lecture and seminar series will go a long way towards achieving that goal. So in this year's lecture series, the first lecture will be given by Professor Amitava Krishna Dutt. I would now request Dr. Prithviraj Guha to introduce our eminent speaker and our session chair.
Warm greetings to everyone present. Uh, so Professor Dotto is a faculty in economics, faculty of economics and political science at the political science department at the University of Notre Dame, USA. In the same university, he is also a faculty fellow member at the Helen Kellogg Institute of International Studies, Joan B. Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies, and Liu Institute of Asia and Asian Studies. Professor Dotto is a macroeconomist. He works at the intersecting areas of growth theory, development economics, economic history, political economy, and international economics. Professor Dotto's education started in Presidency College, where he finished his BA. He was ranked first in the exam. Thereafter, he pursued masters at the University of Calcutta, where also he stood first. And thereafter, he went on to do his PhD in economics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he worked under Professor Lance Taylor. After completion of his PhD, he taught initially at Florida International University, and from 1988 onwards, he has been at the University of Notre Dame. He has also held visiting teaching positions in many different countries like Italy, Austria, Mexico, Brazil, France, and UK. Most notably, he had taught at Bulson College, Cambridge, and also Sorbonne University, Paris. And he has also held various external consulting positions, or, for example, at UNU Wider. He has published in a wide area of journals, including the American Economic Review, Journal of Development Economics, Cambridge Journal of Economics, Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, etc., and has also served in editorial boards of many journals, including Macroeconomics, which he co-edits currently. He has been an author of several books, and currently, most recently, he has written a book on happiness, and he has also edited or co-edited various volumes, most notably the International Handbook on the Handbook on International Economic Development, published by Edward Elgar. So I just highlighted just a few key points from his curriculum vitae. I'm sure Professor Anup Sinha, who will be chairing the session from now on, will have more to say about him. Professor Sinha was also a student in this department, and after which he went to Rochester and Southern California for his graduate studies. He has been a teacher at the erstwhile Presidency College and thereafter at the Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta. He has been a perennial well-wisher of the department, and we are very happy to have him as the session chair today. So I hand over the mic to Professor Sinha, Professor Anup Kumar Sinha.
Thank you very much, Prithviraj, and a very good evening to all of you. Particularly good to see Amitava after a long time, and looking forward to hearing his talk. And I'm also very happy that Professor Mukul Majumdar could join in and be part of this lecture, which is basically commemorating his father. I had never been a student of Professor Nirmal Kanti Majumdar, but I do remember that when I first joined the college, he came in for some official work or something, maybe personal work, and he was entering Deepak Babu's office, or I think Tapush Majumdar's office, and we were told by some of the seniors that he's a very famous professor, and he was also referred to as Mukul Majumdar's father. So, which was also very nice, because I had heard of Mukul Majumdar as a brilliant student, senior to us, much senior to us. But then also I saw his father but he was also introduced as a very famous professor who had retired. And so that is basically sort of the recollection, and it's wonderful to have this particular lecture, and my thanks to Mukulda for initiating this effort. Amitava, I think what you can do is take about 50 minutes, target at 50, but I'll allow you to stretch it to an hour if you want. And we may, with your permission, if you feel comfortable, we can handle about 3 or 4 questions if there are after your presentation, and then we'll wrap it up with, I think, a formal vote of thanks, as is the usual custom. Is that okay with you, Amitava? Then target it between 50 minutes to 60 minutes. Thank you. Over to Amitava.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Well, not here, but at least online here. I'm very grateful to the organizers, Moushumi especially, and I'm sorry about the health issues in her family. I hope they will be very soon overcome. I'm also very grateful that Professor Majumdar and Professor Sen are here, and to I'm very happy to be invited to presidency. I still like to think of it as a college, but of course you've been promoted to a university, and in the occasion of Nirmal Kanti Majumdar's lecture series here. Okay, so this talk I entitled Varieties of Macroeconomics in the 21st Century. 21st century is where we are, so that is self-explanatory. But let me say a few words about macroeconomics and varieties, what I mean by that. And let me also apologize for sometimes speaking in a somewhat strident manner, but this is not aimed at any particular people, but at my own, shall I say, even anger at the current state of macroeconomics. Okay, so if we can go, yes. So first of all, I'm using the word macroeconomics here because Moushumi asked me to talk on macroeconomics, but I use it with some trepidation because first of all, I'm not even sure what economics is anymore. I know that it should not be just economics, it should be an interdisciplinary study incorporating society, politics, psychology, and many things. However, the economy, as distinct from economics, is very important. But the economy needs to be studied in conjunction with other social analytical concepts. So, given my let's say critical comments about economics, it is not a surprise that I should also be critical of macroeconomics. In addition to what I've said about economics, I am rather concerned with the micro-macro distinction. When I started studying economics at Presidency College, I think we were asked to read Paul Samuelson's textbook. I forget which edition we were in, but I studied in the early 70s. A little bit after Onubda and maybe a few years after Professor Majumdar too. Anyway, so that book was about first micro and macro. Now, although there are different questions and issues that might be fit into either the micro and the macro, but many issues simply cannot be divided in this way. For example, inequality is not something that is about micro or macro, that without taking both perspectives, you cannot understand it. International trade and and the effects of, say, trade liberalization cannot be understood with micro trade theory, because that assumes full employment and forgets about asset market issues, which are confined to macro. So, however, of the two, I still have some preference for macro, because it is, after all, a study of a system rather than study of units. And the unit that we study in economics, at least in mainstream economics, is the individual and or the firm, but usually the individual. And I have a lot of problem with the individual. And I'll talk about that maybe briefly later on. Next, let me turn to varieties. What do I mean by that? A lot of people think about different paradigms, different research programs, or about schools of economic thought like neoclassical, classical, about classical political economy, Marxist, Keynesian, etc. Others talk about worldviews, including political worldviews, like in the United States, about liberals and conservatives, or about capitalism and socialism, and so on. In India, in Bengal, we used to talk about Joto Mot, Toto Pot. And this, of course, refers to many ideas and many roads to follow. The Bhagavad Gita seems to suggest that this phrase is nonsensical and mischievous. However, if you read the book, you'll see that it does follow many paths as well. And of course, Sri Ramakrishna is well known as having talked about this idea about you can think of God as both with a form or formless, okay, and that there is no single truth and all else is false is not something he would subscribe to. Anyway, the word varieties I've taken from William James's book, Varieties of Religious Experience, where James actually argues that there are many varieties because religious experiences are really for individuals. And so there are at least as many varieties as individuals in terms of what he called religious experience and religious life. And he was particularly against organized religion, especially religions that tried to make, to create some sort of monolithic block of organized ideas. He also argued that a greater reality that is not easily accessible through normal ways of looking at the world is what religious experience can connect us to. And this can only happen to individuals. He also authored The Pluralistic Universe, where he writes that the universe is so complex and there are so many visions, modes of feeling, experiences, that there is no single true way of looking at the world through what he called monist eyes. So very much a pluralist. I should also say that he pointed out, and this is a quote, he is critical of the over-technicality and consequent dreariness of the younger disciplines at our American universities. And this was written well before the 21st century, of course. And his idea also on rationality was that it is a conception when the thinker has a strong feeling of ease, peace, and rest, a feeling of the sufficiency of the present moment and its absoluteness, as well as praise for parsimony, dislike for blurred outlines and vague identifications. So it's both an idea of thinking for the moment and its absoluteness, but also trying to unify, let us say. So he was very critical of both Spinoza, who focused, according to James, on one substance, and David Hume, who focused on looseness and separateness of everything. So both are barren. Now, lest I be accused of being, too much following the words of Sahibs here, which is William James, these are not just Western ideas, and they're very similar to many in the Indian tradition. And I could go into this at length, but I won't. Mohandas Gandhi has very similar views, especially with his image of the Jain and the blind men and the elephant. Okay, so having said that, Anubda, are you still there?
Yes, I am. I was saving bandwidth. My phone is running down, so
Okay.
don't worry, I'm here.
Okay. So if you can give me some reminders of every 10 minutes, that would be good. Is it possible?
10 minutes, I don't want to. I'll give you one at 40, 45 minutes. I'll tell you, you can go at most 10 minutes or so. And since we have stopped, so I would request all the participants that if you have questions on Professor Dutt's talk, please put them up on the chat line, and Gangudi will be sort of editing those, and we can pick up 3 or 4 questions depending on the time that you have. But Amitava, I'll give you a warning. Don't worry. You continue comfortably.
Warn gently. Okay. All right. So what I will do is to focus on varieties of macroeconomics and argue for the virtue of pluralism, like James does, but in the context of macroeconomics. And especially, I will be very critical of the privileged place of individual optimization and the use of econometric and other mathematical methods to excess of macroeconomics. I have nothing to complain about using individual optimization or econometric methods or mathematics, but about the privileged place, almost to the exclusion of everything else, is what I have a problem with. So here is an outline of what I will say after this rather long alap, you might say, is a quick overview of macroeconomics from Keynes and earlier to after Keynes, through world events and coming to the 21st century. Then I will talk a little bit more about what I mean by dimensions of analysis and pluralism in what way. And this is sometimes a lot of confusion about what pluralism might refer to. Then I will comment on some particular varieties of macroeconomics that I find present or relevant in the 21st century, and in that context, perhaps sneak in my preferred approaches. Okay. So in looking at the overview of varieties of macroeconomics, I hope I'll be excused for being a little bit autobiographical in the sense of how I perceive things. And I'll divide this into, I believe, 6 phases. The first phase is well before me. This is when Keynes first developed what is called macroeconomic theory. And in a 1937 paper, he argued that he was making 2 main contributions. This is published just after the general theory was published. And there he says the first thing is the important role of uncertainty. And the second is to take an overall view of the economy and not at individual markets. So a systemic view. And it's from there, although Ragnar Frisch has used the word micro and macro in the context of economics, he did not use those terms. And this was really, you might say, Keynes's originality to pioneering efforts to develop a macro. Now, there was no such distinction before that in the earlier economists, including the mercantilists or the classical economists Karl Marx, they did not distinguish micro and macro, but studied both these issues that you might call micro and macro altogether. The marginalists in the 1870s and later neoclassicals like Marshall and Pigou did not really have a macro approach. Basically, there were theories of individual markets and how price changes maybe led to the trade cycle, which was as macro as they could be, and unemployment, if present, was due to the nefarious actions of unions and other things like that. So Keynes actually is the one who developed the notion of unemployment equilibrium, which cannot be solved by flexible wages. So that was phase one. Phase two, this is again before my time, is discussed by George Akerlof in his recent article, where he, of course, was a student at MIT. And I can compare this to when I was a student at MIT. So it's useful to look at that. Not that MIT or the Cambridges are the center of the world, but sometimes they believe that they are. So he says that macroeconomics in MIT was basically focusing on the theories of Paul Samuelson, Hicks from UK, and Alvin Hansen, and that their idea was to get rid of unemployment by fiscal and monetary policies. So once that is taken care of, according to Akerlof, the focus turns to economic growth with Solow's own theories, neoclassical theories. I must say that Solow tells a rather different story here. I don't think he was developing his growth theory as a way of analyzing the real world, but as he modestly said, he just swept Keynesian problems under the rug and just wanted to solve Harrod's problem of long-run growth through flexible coefficients of production. But in any case, around the same time, of course, unlike the US, where the idea was to, solve problems, okay, let's get rid of unemployment and so forth. In UK, they were more theoretically inclined with Hicks, Mead, Harrod, Joan Robinson, and so forth. One important idea that came out from Hicks was the SILL model, which of course has come now called the ISLM model. I'm sorry, let me see if I can turn this off somehow, but I don't know how. Anyway, but also there was an emphasis on dynamics of growth with Harrod, Robinson, Kaldor, which actually did not assume full employment as Solow did. So there was a Keynesian extension to dynamics. So that's phase two, before my time. Phase three, if I could, is when, now this is changing both time and space, okay? So I am a student in Presidency College in the early 70s, and also after that, a graduate student studying masters at Katakol. Does that still exist, Katakol? Probably. Okay. So
yes, very very much.
Okay, good. Okay. That was already a university, so it couldn't have changed its name. So so there actually we read Keynes, or at least parts of Keynes, if not the whole. Most of us couldn't understand many of the things in it, and I still don't. But at Presidency College, we were exposed to Keynesian models, first through the diagonal cross model of Paul Samuelson, then the SILL or ISLM model of Hicks, but not really the Hicksian version, which if I read today, I find very different from the model that we see. The Hansen model, really, with a fixed price. And however, with no discussion of expectations and uncertainty. And finally, the third was the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, where price is a variable. I remember Professor Deepak Banerjee teaching us about the diagonal cross. He had left the tap open, flowing with water, and said this is a leakage, and let me close it. Okay, so to keep the circular flow going. And then Professor Rokit talking about ISLM and ADAS. And we read Modigliani, Hicks, Petinkin, and others. We learned about liquidity traps and how investment did not sometimes respond to the interest rate. And we also talked about wage rigidity. There was even some talk of Friedman's critique, which at that time. Now, now there were three varieties at this time. One is Keynes, difficult, often forgotten, not referred to again. In fact, I find the two chapters in the general theory that are of most interest is the second chapter on investment, which is about beauty contests and things like that, and the chapter on the implications of wage flexibility. I think chapter 19, but those we completely neglected at that time. And the second was the neoclassical synthesis Keynesians, which put in some rigidity, like the liquidity trap, or like interest not affecting investment, and so on. And we used to have these pictures drawn by Mihir Babu about showing how we get unemployment and so on. And then we were also told about, of course, classical and neoclassical theory, which Keynes called it classical because he put all classical and neoclassical economists together. Not that he was doing an oversimplified picture of history of economic thought, but because he focused on Say's law, which aside from Malthus and Marx, but Keynes didn't talk very much about Marx, too dangerous to talk about. And he would focus on Say's law as neoclassical and classical theory, and he said that that was especially through interest rates clearing saving and investment, and therefore the goods market. And he was this was very different from Keynes because it was always full employment. Three comments about this. We were also introduced to some what might be called micro foundations, like Modigliani, Brumberg, Ando, Tobin on liquidity preference, Duesenberry on relative income and relative consumption on other people, behind consumption, investment demand, and the marginal efficiency of capital, like in Fisher, and so on. And then also the Phillips curve, which is not really micro foundations, but of course an empirical regularity, which would say how wages would change with unemployment. There was some discussion of heterodox ideas. In presidency, it was only in the study of the Indian economy and maybe a little bit in development issues, but hardly any heterodox ideas. It's when we went to Katakol that we were exposed to things like the history of economic thought and some theories of Harrods, Schaffer, Kaldor, Pasinetti, but very little of Kalecki and very little about Marx outside the history of economic thought. Now, let me also point out that we had one impediment or rigidity, which I consider to be a real plus. Why is that? Well, there were long lags from word in the centers of knowledge to come to the peripheries of Kolkata, because there was no internet. And also to read a paper, we would have to not photocopy it because that was not available, but we had to hand copy it, sitting in the reading room of Presidency College or in the library of Katakal. So obviously we couldn't read much because we had to copy them. And while copying them, we didn't pay attention. So we read it after that. So the point is we didn't read much. But what we read, we really went deeply into. And secondly, we weren't exposed to what is now called cutting edge work. And I'm very glad that we weren't, but that is a different issue. Okay, now phase 4 is when I left and went to the United States, and this was the very late 70s and early 80s. And by this time, we had already had the great stagflation of high unemployment and high inflation. And this was supposedly what destroyed Keynesianism and led to the rise of Friedman and so forth. And this is also around the time when Thatcher and Reagan were doing the Washington, and others with the economists were doing the Washington Consensus and spreading the god of neoliberalism around the world. Now, here there were 4 main approaches, and let me say that we were taught by 3 people who were pretty important at this time. Dornbusch, Fisher, and Solow taught macro. So this was in 4 versions. One is some version of the neoclassical synthesis Keynesianism, which was taught by Dornbusch and Fisher. By the way, I used that textbook to teach intermediate macro several years after that as well. But there was one difference, that in the short run, there was some sort of wage rigidity, which was Keynesian. And in the medium term, there was wage flexibility. So you got to full employment, the vertical supply curve. So this was not only neoclassical synthesis in terms of method, but also it became neoclassical in the medium run. The second version was monetarism Mark I of Friedman and Phelps, where they said that fiscal and monetary policy is effective, it works, but only due to expectational errors. Workers formed expectations about the price, and when there was an expansion in money supply, what would happen is that the actual price would actually rise, but they wouldn't notice it because they formed the expectations from before. And the money weight would rise. So what would happen is that they would think that the expected real wage would be higher, and this would make them expand labor supply. But sooner or later, they caught up with it and adjusted expectations adaptively. And then you got back to the full employment situation. So the working was by fooling. And if you continue trying to expand, of course, as Friedman pointed out, you got accelerationism, acceleration of inflation, and what is called Nehru. Somebody once told me, is that named after Jawaharlal Nehru from your country? I said, no, not really. Okay. But anyway, then, of course, once you realize what Friedman was doing, why would workers always be fooled into thinking the price is not changing just because they didn't deal with goods markets, but only in the labor market? In came rational expectations. Okay, I had not, I believe, heard of this in India. As I said, news travels fast. Okay, does not travel fast if you're in the periphery. Maybe I had, but it didn't really ring a bell. And there was Lucas, Sargent, and not only was there full employment as in Friedman, but there was also policy relevance. You couldn't do anything because as soon as you increased fiscal spending or monetary spending, what would happen is that expectations, aside from stochastic random error terms, would actually be fully forecast by all relevant actors who understood the model. and would recalculate expectations based on that. Okay, and so essentially what it was removing adaptive expectations, as in Friedman, with rational expectations. So the only way policy could be effective is if policy was random and nobody could forecast exactly what would go on. And what kind of policy is that? Just to have effectiveness, you fool the people. Okay. Now, I remember uh, Robert Solow teaching us some of these things and saying that he was very displeased with this, but he was displeased with market clearing. The wage was completely flexible, but somebody asked him, some of us asked him, well, what about rational expectations? Is that a fair representation of people? Well, he thought about it and said somewhat grudgingly that, I don't know why we would have irrational expectations. Anupta, can you please give me advance warning before the 10-minute? How much left?
You have a max of half an hour left.
Oh, okay, all right. So I'm making decent progress, I think. So Solow said that, well, nobody has a theory of irrational or systematically irrational expectations, so perhaps we should accept rational expectations. At that time, that seems to make sense, but I think Solow was completely wrong. I admire Solow greatly. However, the point that I now come to is to recognize there is nothing called rational, nothing called irrational. So this duality is something that has to be given up. Now, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't think through things and act with some good reasons, but the notion of rationality in the rational expectations people was completely bizarre. So what did Solow do? He introduced us to new Keynesian economics, and there were 3 branches, but I will discuss them in a little bit detail later on. Phase 5, after I graduated, and this is sort of autobiographical, as I said, not focusing on me, but focusing on what I saw. And I think this also is sensible phases in macroeconomics. After coursework was done, and I was working on my PhD, I learned about heterodox thinking from attending Lance Taylor's classes, and we learned about Kalecki, Steindl, Latin American structuralism, Markov pricing, income distribution, classes, economic growth and stagnation. Also, Stephen Margolin in those days at Harvard was writing about alternative growth distribution models. So I did my thesis roughly connected with some of these issues, and this made me connect theoretical work to what I had read in India about the Indian economy, and this taught by, for example, Professor Omio Bagchi, and about how inequality can cause economic stagnation. Now, at this, I should say that unlike Akerlof, Solow did not talk about neoclassical growth theory at all. Okay, neither his own nor others. Okay, and there was also no discussion of financial crises other than in development courses. That's where financial crisis occurred. We didn't think that was an important issue. If there were small ones with some crooks and cheats stealing money from retirement accounts and so on. Now, then I started to teach graduate and undergraduate macro, and although I didn't care much for mainstream developments, at that time I thought it was my duty to teach mainstream macro to the graduate students especially, so I kept track of it. And while doing that, I realized that in this phase, there were lots of alternatives. Solow, I read a paper by him, 1979, where he included what he called equilibrium models, classical, monetarist, and rational expectations. Then he talked about post-Keynesian approaches of various kinds, which he did not like very much, because he said they were more like a state of mind than clear models. But he did mention people like Paul Davidson and others. And then disequilibrium models of the new Keynesian variety, especially the partial equilibrium models like efficiency wages and so forth, which I'll come to later. Then Phelps had a book in 1990 where he talked about 7 schools of macroeconomic thought. And I said, oh, this is good variety, isn't it? But as I read it carefully, he kind of nitpicks and calls different things the same thing by different names in different versions. The Blanchard and Fisher started the macro textbook. I don't know if it's still used, starts with growth theory of the Ramsey and overlapping generations versions, gets quickly into sunspots and other kinds of expectational mechanisms, and then talks about neoclassical and new Keynesian models. And after that, late in the book, some useful models. And I wonder why he didn't start with useful models to begin with. But there he went back to things like ISLM. Then with a friend and colleague, I wrote a book on Keynes's third alternative, where we looked at varieties of macroeconomics at that time. And I was still taking a look at it while preparing for this talk. And we focused, of course, a lot on the third alternative, which was neo-Ricardian Keynesianism and post-Keynesianism, where we distinguish between classical, neoclassical, rational expectations, monetary schools, which saw wages and all things in the economy as being cleared by flexibility of wages and prices and interest rates. So this was full employment. Of course, by full employment, I mean Nairu or there could be some surge unemployment or something like that. But basically full employment. And then we had unemployment in the mainstream Keynesians, where you have some rigidity, either explained or unexplained, which would cause unemployment. And one solution is either to make wages and prices flexible, or to use monetary and fiscal policy to solve the problem. And the third alternative said wages are rigid, prices maybe are rigid, but if you make them flexible, things get worse. And this is our third alternative, and I believe the one that Keynes really was talking about. And then there is a book which is still quite useful by Snowden and Vane, who talks about all kinds of different approaches, including some ones that weren't covered before, like the real business cycle, then Austrian and new political macroeconomics, and so forth. My own research, of course, focused on heterodox approaches, drawing on Smith, Ricardo, Marx, Galecki, Keynes, Steindl, even some Indian authors. I remember reading the book by Amir Rokit on the dual economy, and then also some work by Amit Bhaduri. And finally, we come to phase 6, when I stopped teaching graduate macro and eventually even gave up intermediate macro. And I won't go into why, but I moved to the political science department and I taught things that I really liked. And except for calling them economics, I call them political economy of inequality and things like that. Okay. Now, I still read some mainstream work during this phase because I would teach graduate classes in other places sometimes. And while researching on macro, how can you give up reading some of the great minds in mainstream? So I read that, but overall, not very carefully. And I now think I didn't miss much at all. And this is the phase of the real business cycle theory and what is called the dynamic general equilibrium models. What is it? Um, dynamics
DSGE.
dynamic stochastic general equilibrium, DSGE models. Okay. Let me now move to my third point, which is dimensions. And I'll go to this very quickly because I know if I don't go quickly, I will spend too much time talking about this, okay? Because I really think this is very important. Now, the dimensions of any analysis, especially social analysis about human beings, one can divide into, I believe, if I can look at the next slide, please. Yeah, into six. I mean, go back now. Thank you. Into six different dimensions with some sub-dimensions as well. Now, let me try to be as clear as I can in a very quick way. One is what I might call epistemology, which is two things. One is, well, essentially, what does knowledge mean, right? How do we know that we know? What is the meaning of knowledge? And this is having some organizing principle of thinking when, according to William James, we suddenly realize we've got it. The light bulb, it goes off, but it's an internal mental construction. Let me give you two examples. One is the neoclassical approach of optimizing individuals, which is usually called methodological individualism. We live, therefore we are. We are individuals, okay? And the other is that we are rational. In other words, we optimize. Now, in reality, this is not in reality. I think that this is a very, very misleading way of looking at things. There's nothing wrong with looking at it this way, but to insist that all economics must be based on this, as most of neoclassical economics does, even when it says we depart from it a little bit, okay, because of maybe we are irrational, but we are predictably irrational. We have bounded rationality. Even then, we are actually thinking about rationality in some way. Another approach is to use class struggle, which is, of course, Marx, or you can even call Marx discussing dialectical materialism as his analytical approach. And then the structuralists in the social sciences, but also in economics, who are concerned with not individual units, but the structure of the whole system and how they fit in. You cannot make sense of individual units, be they individual people or words in language, without looking at the structure of the whole language or the whole society. So incidentally, you can have various such organizing principles, like John Romer would be using both, you might say, Marxian ideas of class, but also micro-foundational ideas of neoclassical economics. So where would you put him? I don't know. And the other is, I should say that this is incomplete. It's only a starting point. Okay, when you want to use of the optimizing individual, you have not said what are the constraints, what are the objectives, what are the beliefs. So all of this has to be put in later. Without that, this can explain anything. It is, in other words, a tautology, but a useful tautology because it organizes our thinking. Then the other thing is that these are just mental construction. It's not clear what they have to do with the real world. So we have to bring in some sort of validation or verification or something like that to connect it with the real world. And here, you can do econometric studies and maybe test hypotheses. But the problem, I will talk about this a little bit later. Second point is ontology. What does the world look like? Now, the Greeks and maybe some of the Indians thought of ontology in terms of basic matter or basic ideas behind everything. We don't do that anymore, fortunately. But we can think of what are the important ideas of the real world, and we think in terms of what elements of it do, what parts of it do, what the systems do, how it moves over time. Um, Now, I should say also that the system should not be just about the economy, but has to look at society and politics and the psychology of human beings to understand anything. Now, lest you ask me, well, can one know anything about if you have to study everything? And I would argue a much better way of looking at questions is by looking at issues like inequality, like consumerism, rather than arbitrary disciplines. Then methodology, by which I mean how the analysis is done, how it's expressed, and what is its purpose. So, for example, there are nomothetic laws of motion versus ideographic. There is mathematical, verbal, um, simple mathematical, more complex mathematical. Now, I should say at this point that models are not meant to be uh, depictions of reality. Okay, as Friedman famously says, assumptions are all unrealistic, and rightly so, because all you can do is predict. Um, Now, model is not about reality as a representation, but it is trying to understand some crucial aspects of reality. Otherwise, I think we should just throw the models away. Then there could be deductive versus inductive, and they could have different purposes, as I said, like understanding, explaining, or predicting. Predicting we should not do. I would argue even explaining economists should not do, but only understanding. Empirical, how is information, data obtained, analyzed? I won't go into this. What I mean is what kinds of information, qualitative, quantitative, descriptive, conceptual, how do we get it from published statistics, published by somebody else, or archival, ethnographic, survey, experimental, case studies? Then what methods do we use to analyze? Statistical, informal methods, descriptive, discursive. And then what is the relationship of this to epistemology? Is it a way of bringing in real issues into your assumptions, or is it just to test them? Now, here I'd like to point to the Duhem-Quine thesis.
Amitava, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have to speed up a little bit. Duhem-Quine thesis says that you cannot test any hypothesis in isolation in terms of econometrics, because there are always auxiliary assumptions that are in there that you can change whatever you like to prove, quote unquote, within reasonable bounds, any result you want to. So econometrics, except for very, very few cases, can make anything look bad or anything look good. And this is what I found has happened to the latest phase of macroeconomics. If you read a paper by Paul Romer, which I will talk about, he essentially says this is pseudoscience. I agree with that, except there is no such thing as real science in economics. Anyway, another part is the axiological or normative. What is good? What is an improvement? Okay, you cannot have a value-free science. I won't go into this. I hope you're all beyond that. What are the values? Is it growth, efficiency? Is it inequality? Is it to reduce sufferings of those, especially at the bottom, to allow people to develop and flourish? Is money a distraction? And so forth. These kinds of environmental and social degradation. And then sixth and finally is what should be done? Now, when we were trained as economists, we were told, well, maybe there's a problem. Well, first of all, if there's no problem, nothing. Okay, governments should do nothing except for what is called the night watchman or the protector against foreign evils, right? But then we realize if there are problems, either due to distributional issues or market failures or both, then government should step in. The problem is, of course, the government doesn't just step in. It represents certain interests. It represents, let's say, politics and political economy. And so you can't just leave things to to government policy. Governments may be very good, may be very, very bad for all kinds of reasons, or maybe incapable. Then the second is, if not the government, who? Well, you can have social and political movements, okay? But here we need to understand what makes these movements work and what doesn't work. Finally, and I would say this is something that Gandhi focused on a lot, which is individual change, including, most of all, oneself. I'll come back to this issue together later. I think 1 and 2 of these is more macroeconomic, but the last one is what I would call normative or ethical individualism, quite different from methodological or epistemic individualism. Okay, let me stop there on that. Okay, now some macro approaches today. Now, Feyerabend, I forget his first name now, methodologist, said, let many flowers bloom. Now, how many, I don't know, okay? Now, we can't have too many flowers bloom, and how do we know some of them are not weeds? So I will talk about a few, mostly summarizing what I've said before and adding a little bit to it. So the first is the general theory of Keynes. This is one flower. And here there are actually 3 flowers that are often forgotten. One is what Keynes called the market period, with the short period expectations and the price which clears the market. If this sounds heretical, if you read the general theory, it is not. The price is not fixed in Keynes anywhere. The second is the short run model. And this is the model we really focus on and other people have taken, which is the aggregate supply price and aggregate demand price, but he drew them in employment expenditure space. But this is basically the idea of unemployment, equilibrium with a given money wage and given money supply and so forth. And then what is called the historical model, quote unquote, there's no mathematical model. And this is the one that talks about uncertainty and the problems of wage dynamics. The next set of flowers is the ISLM or SILL in RY space. The third, which followed that, in fact, is the diagonal cross. And then we come to the ADAS, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And let me now use, well, this is the 45-degree diagram. I should point out just one thing about this is that this is not often emphasized. What is the adjustment like? If you're not in equilibrium or the 45-degree line and C plus I plus G, what takes you there? One is the idea of instantaneous output adjustment. It can happen like that, okay? Second is through price changes. And the third is through inventory accumulation, decumulation. Now, these all can be studied very carefully, and one should not just say, forget about it, let's just assume that it's done. Next one, yeah, this is the ADAS. I'm sure I don't need to go through it. So the AD curve shows equilibrium in the money market or bond market and the goods market. And the aggregate supply curve essentially says wages are rigid, or at least they're a function of employment, which is equations 8 or equations 8a. And given that, you can have an upward rising aggregate supply curve, which means essentially in the standard model with this real wage equals marginal product, that as the price rises, the real wage is lower, firms will hire more labor and produce more output, essentially, okay? So this is the standard ADAS picture. This is derived sometimes from the ISLM, in my opinion, somewhat incorrectly. But anyway, we can go on next, please. And then this is a way of looking at the classical model, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And this is a way of looking at the monetarist model, which is you start with this situation, and then aggregate demand rises, but aggregate supply, which is based on a given expected price, does not rise. It goes up here. You always have full employment, and then it goes back here. Rational expectancy says that it doesn't go from here to here, it just goes from here to here, except for stochastic terms. So that's the only point. Now, one other thing is if you can go back, please. Yeah, the neoclassical synthesis model. Could we go back to the previous slide quickly? Yeah, this picture also can summarize the neoclassical synthesis, which is you're stuck here. Did I do that or? Okay, so you're stuck at this aggregate supply curve and this aggregate demand curve, but this is stuck because of some idea of wage rigidity. Okay, and then if the wage is allowed to be flexible in the long run, this curve will go down to here. Okay, next. Next, I'll talk about post-Keynesians and Kaleckians. Post-Keynesian ideas are based on endogenous money, debt deflation, financial crises due to uncertainty, and things like that. And what this means is that the aggregate demand curve might be looked at as upward rising. And if this is the aggregate supply curve, and if you have a reduction in wages, like in the neoclassical synthesis, you don't come nearer this one, but you go further away. That's a simple way of using ADAS to understand this. And this is Kalecki, income distribution, classes, and markup pricing. If you can go back, please. Where this is the aggregate demand curve, where as the price increases, the real wage falls. And this means that consumption falls because workers consume more as a ratio of the income than capitalists do. So this is aggregate demand is due to distributional shifts. And this is the markup pricing equation. And this says that if you start from here and wages are flexible, this curve will fall because of the fall in real wages. This curve will fall because price will fall, and you'll go nowhere to full employment. So these therefore suggest wage flexibility is not going to solve the problem. If anything, if real wages are flexible, you'll actually go in this direction rather than this direction. Okay, now let me just mention two more. Go to the next one, please. New Keynesians. There are three types of new Keynesians. One is the kind that has probably gone out of fashion now, and perhaps with some good reason. This is the fixed price disequilibrium models, which essentially say how to make sense of unemployment and Keynesian economics using Walrasian models by putting in some fixed price somewhere. This we had started learning in Katakol with Barrow and Grossman, okay, and also Clower, old papers, but later on with Malinvo and Benassi. And this essentially means with a rigid price, you are in the short side of the market, okay, and so one market doesn't clear. What this means is that there is a spillover into another market, and this is essentially the whole idea. Now, the second approach to new Keynesian economics is to accept the rational expectations hypothesis, but put in some nominal rigidities. And this is like, for example, Azariadis, it's Stanley Fisher, Greg Mankiw. So essentially, it is put some rigidity on the movement of the wage or the price that prevents you from going to the rational expectations full employment equilibrium. The third approach is what's called the micro foundations of rigidities. And this comes in at least four versions. One is the labor market. And by that, I mean, why doesn't wage flexibility reduce or remove unemployment? Answers are, as you probably all know very well, efficiency wage, implicit contracts, union bargaining, insider-outsider model, which can even lead to hysteresis. Then you have goods market with imperfect competition, large firms, product differentiation leading to coordination problems. Or in Mankiw's work, menu costs, which I've never understood really, except in figurative terms. What's so expensive about changing a menu, especially if it's online these days? Okay, so and then you have credit market imperfections due to asymmetric information, where the lender doesn't know if the borrower is going to, what type the borrower is, or what the borrower is going to do. And this is essentially Stiglitz, White's, and so on. And then you have
Can
some
you finish
deviation.
in 5 minutes?
What? How
Can
many
you
minutes?
finish in 5 minutes?
Okay, I will finish. Okay. Then you have neo-rationality, okay, which is from Akerlof and other people, which basically uses the envelope theorem to say even slight deviations from quote-unquote optimizing equilibrium would actually result in large macroeconomic effects. Okay, and then we come to real business cycle theory in the form of dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, Kydland, Prescott, and so forth. But it is essentially the real business cycle, which says that because you don't have expectational errors due to monetary policy, the only thing that can change output is real shocks. And what are the real shocks? They're technology shocks. Okay, I remember a colleague who used to work in one of the Federal Reserve's banks, the worst of the lot, but I won't go into that, who said in the middle of the crisis of 2007-8, there is no crisis. I said, why? How do you know that? Oh, there's no real shock. So banks are failing, but he says there's no real shock. Where's the technology shock? Anyway, so that is their idea. But of course, the DSGE became a very complicated model to teach because it consisted of an infinite horizon model of the forever living dynasty with stochastic elements thrown into that with no real reason that I can see, except to call it stochastic. And you have dynamic optimization, but essentially saying the same thing. And then Woodford wrote around that time, there's a convergence in macroeconomic thought, a new synthesis called the new neoclassical synthesis. Okay, and this consists of coherent intertemporal general equilibrium framework with micro and macro not fundamentally different. It's all micro now, the infinitely lived dynamic agent. Markets may clear, may not clear. If they clear, you're more like the classicals. If they don't clear, you're more like the Keynesians, and that is due to adjustment frictions. All models have to be econometrically validated. Expectation formation is endogenous, by which they meant everybody accepts rational expectations. They admit that real shocks are important and monetary shocks do matter also. To me, this is old wine in newer and newer bottles. First with rigidities in the ADAS model, then with rational expectation models, and now with dynamic optimizing models. Next, please. Yeah. So let me now conclude. This so-called convergence that Woodford talks about has not been treated kindly by the real world events. Perhaps after he wrote the paper and before it was published, he had the Great Recession. Okay, and all his claims of scientific validity and convergence in a unified approach broke down. And the crisis occurred, and all the great mainstream economists said macroeconomics had failed because it could not predict the financial crisis and the general recession. Now, I don't think it failed because it could not predict. In fact, economists shouldn't be predicted anyway. What it failed was to even understand what was going on, which many people outside orthodoxy understood very well, and which was the debt accumulation and increases in inequality. Okay, the only person in the mainstream who made the warning was Indian. What is the name? Ram. Yeah, the guy who was governor
Raghuram
of the. Yeah, Rajan. Yeah, um, but now nobody predicted when it would occur, and nobody can, of course. So the real problem, I think, is because of the over-fixation with methodological individualism. To me, individuals exist because I exist, you exist. However, are we really individuals, or are we complex bundle of nerves like David Hume talks about? And do we have split personalities? I think we all do. As even the comic books know, angel, devil, and they're always fighting. Okay, and what will happen doesn't depend so much on us, although it might, but on the external situation and who we hang out with. Okay, classes may be much more important than individual rationality. What is rational? I challenge you to tell me what that means in the real world. Okay, there is no such thing. All it is once you put down all the details about this is my objective. What is your objective? What is my objective? I don't know what it is. Okay. And also, in an uncertain world, how do we know what we are doing will lead to what we think will happen? Okay. So all this makes this whole idea of individualism and rationality as really crazy. Mathematics is about
Call from 15165.
yeah, I'll finish just now. So mathematics is a very good tool for understanding something, but not for explaining. It is not meant to depict the real world. Therefore, no point testing if it works. You can make anything work by adding suitable hypothesis, which the dynamic what it's called dynamic stochastic DSGE models are very good at doing by choosing. And this is, please read Paul Romer's article on the nonsense of all of this. So I find it much more interesting to forget about American, especially macroeconomic currents who deal with whether the growth rate will be 3% or 2% and what will happen to inflation. Will it be 10% or 5% or 2%? But much more look at the country that you're working on, look at its structure, use ideas from all over the place, from Smith, Marx, institutionalists, Keynesians, structuralists, and so on. And for goodness sake, don't think about growth, okay? We are told that growth is good for the poor because it's going to lift them up. It'll lift up the income, but probably make them more miserable, quite apart from the environmental problems that continuous growth. I think of growth more as cancer than as what Adam Smith thought it was. Anyway, so that's the end of my discussion.
Thank you very much, Amitava, for a engaging and a very wide-spanning subject on which you talked almost the history of macroeconomics. I think we are a little, I was told that we have a hard stop at about 8:30. So if there are, Gaguri, do we have a lot of questions on the chat?
No, in the chat box, there is no question actually.
Okay. So then if anybody has a very quick comment, a couple of comments maybe, then we can close with a vote of thanks. And anybody has a quick comment on what Amitava said? There is.
We have a question from one of our students, Anandarupa. So should I read out the question?
Yeah, please. We'll take only this question then, and if there's no other comments, we can close. Okay. I'll close and then hand it over back to you for.
Okay. Okay, so the question is, I have the following question. So she has got two questions. In a world that is becoming more and more oriented and dogmatic towards neoliberal economics, how are post-Keynesian economists trying to include heterodox economics in various syllabi and research interest? And secondly, also, how do you plan to inject post-Keynesian economics in modern political economy? So these were the two questions.
This itself may take a long lecture. So a quick response from you, Amitava, and we can.
Yes, I'm fortunately at an age, my own age is where I don't have to think about what impact it will have, okay, but just to think and to write. However, what happens is outside the citadels of learning, the highly ranked institutions, uh, these things are actually making some headway. Okay, unfortunately, the the least thoughtful of them, one that is making the rounds, is called modern monetary theory, which has some good ideas, but even some mainstream scholars have started taking them seriously. But I think that some of the developments can happen outside economics. As I mentioned, I'm very troubled with economics itself. So I'm in the political science department. You can be in area studies, development studies, and continue with this kind of work. And they won't be published in American Economic Review or Econometrica. But frankly, who gives a damn?
Okay, thank you. I think it's time for us to close. It's 8:25, and I'll just make one remark that I think Amitava started out by saying there is. He quoted somebody saying that there should be, plurality, 100 flowers bloom or many flowers bloom. I think it still does not. The economy has grown more complex and more difficult to understand in terms of one encompassing theory. So if people continue to do research in their own way, in terms of their own, let's say, worldview or pre-analytical visions in what they did, or they could sort of continue to work with some existing organizing principles, it would still give us some more, I wouldn't say necessarily useful knowledge, but at least some output from which you never know some brilliant idea could emerge, maybe another Keynes, another Pelitsky, another Solo, who knows. So that way, I will end with an optimistic thing. I'll just share with you sort of something that I just read this morning. I think it was in the latest Economist, that you have this simple things like there is unemployment in USA. There is a lot of union action taking place after a long time, strikes happening, and you also have a large bunch of people who are quitting steady jobs. So you have unemployment, you have labor market dropouts, and you also have very, very strident, after a long time, industrial action. Real wages have been at least stagnant, if not falling over a long time. So that's a kind of a quiz question, a puzzle on which all of us could think about. But thank you very much. There are these always sort of what you could call brain candy in a way, that there are issues, if you look around, that you would like to think about, and probably some young researcher would be coming up with novel explanations, as you said. But thank you very much for taking your time in delivering this lecture. And I would like to hand over with good evening to everybody, to Gaguri or whoever is going to give the vote of thanks.
So,
Thank you, Professor Dutt, for such a wide-spanning and thought-provoking lectures. Okay, so our students who are starting their journey in reading economics, so they will think much, and probably they will be able up to they will be able to develop the matters, following their different thinking processes. Thank you, Professor Sina.
Okay, could I just say one thing, or is that really over? I mean,
No, there is nothing like that.
okay. What I wanted to say is that if you're doing macroeconomics without thinking of the holy trinity of power, uncertainty, and institutions, then you're doing something very wrong. Okay. Now, what these words mean, one can talk at length and, but let me just say, for young scholars, learn from great people, okay? But don't learn from them uncritically. Criticize everything. I had a teacher in my school before I went to Presidency College who taught me, question everything, question the so-called great people, but with some respect, because they're old at least, okay, even if they're not brilliant. What has happened is that these become a self-referential group of people who don't think anymore. They are concerned about their citations, about their journals, about their careers. Not everyone, but by and large, the system makes them into that. So please, get a life, get a job, don't starve. But if you want to get to the top of something, that something will collapse. Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's true. So, thank you, Professor Sinha, for conducting the session. Thank you, Mukulda. This is the first time, we got you among ourselves. And thank you to our colleagues joining from our department, from other departments, from other universities. And especially, I thank you, all the students, who joined, maybe after doing their classes, regular classes, etc. There is the problem of bandwidth with them. Okay, and really this is a difficult time, as Professor Majumdar mentioned. So thank you, everybody. And before closing the session, I'll just like to tell you, this is the first lecture in the series. So we have 2 more lectures on 29th of this month, and the last lecture will be on 12th November. And in our website, you will get the links. So please register yourself if you didn't do so far. So thank you, everybody, once again. And with this, we are closing.
মুকুলদা ভালো আছেন?
চলছে আছি। Times are very difficult. We are, family members have, people are losing family members, people are losing friends, and so on. It's hard.
Terrible.
I'm waiting for the third, waiting for the booster.
কলকাতায় তো একটু প্রবলেম দুর্গাপূজার পর একটু বেড়ে গেছে।
একটু বেড়েছে লাস্ট 5-6 দিন। এটা এক্সপেক্টেড। তারপরে আবার কালী পুজো, ভাইফোঁটা এসব তো আসছে।